So today I am talking with the amazing Cece Sykes. Now, Cece Sykes is a pioneer of addictive processes with internal family systems and also running workshops to help therapists own their story, own their journey, and own how come they're here, what took them to be a therapist, so that they can embody more their truth. Talking with Cece was really like talking to an amazing master or mistress of their work, their art, somebody who's really embodied what they do, who has humour, fun, style, art and creativity, and it was such a privilege. And I hope that you really enjoy this interview. So thank you very, very much, Cece, for coming on this show with me today. I'm very grateful to you for coming on. It's a complete thrill. And Cece, I've been listening to you a lot, which has been wonderful. And I just wanted to ask you, Cece, if you wouldn't mind speaking to a little bit about IFS and what that might mean, because some people would be very new to it, if that would be okay, and your particular interests in with IFS as well.
Sure. Well, thanks, Kate, and thanks for having me on. It's good to be here. IFS, Internal Family Systems, was developed in the 1980s by a therapist named Richard Schwartz, who actually was trained as a family therapist. So that was his initial training, and family therapists work a lot with systems. So when you're working with a family, sort of a classic example of family therapy is to use a traditional family. If mom says A and dad says B, what will child do? C, whatever they want, because the parents are in conflict. So the child is neglected or blamed, but not taken care of. So in family therapy, rather than focus on the child, what's wrong with the child, they focused on the parents and how to help the parents collaborate. So, and that there was a polarization there. So they looked at these ideas about the way a system works, that everyone's trying to find balance, and the child tries to stay balanced by not choosing one parent over the other, and so then does their own thing and is symptomatic. So, okay, that's how I was trained too. That's how Dick Schwartz was trained. I'm in Chicago. He's in Chicago. There's a family therapy community in Chicago. And one day we hear, Dick has a new idea, Dick Schwartz. So we drive downtown to hear Dick's new idea. And so here we are always talking about this external system and not getting into the individual psychopathology of a child or a mom or a dad or any parent. And he comes in and says, well, I'm now working with the inner world of people. And we're like, the what? You know, we're working with the inner motivations. And what he decided, because he thinks in sort of a system, he decided that the inner world looked to him and sounded to him like a system. He was working with eating disorders. And he was working with, primarily women who were binging, purging, or restricting and exercising. And he was noticing that they had all these polarities. I want to do this. I hate myself for doing it. I have to do it. Like opposites in a system. And so he started out of he's in a research project and he's trying to get good results, right? And so he finally said, why don't you talk to that part? Well, have that part talk to the other part. No, have this other part step back. How you would in a family. Nope, now dad and son are talking now, mom, you step back. So nope, the critic, you step back, let the binger and the purger talk to each other. And also finding, of course, is they did this, that there are other deeper emotions, right? Of course, why are we surprised? Just like the child has deeper emotions other than acting out, and the mother has, so these parts had deeper emotions, so that there would be emotions behind, there'd be very young parts, very tender parts, and then very more protective parts that are out there in the world. So we all heard this and said, whoa, wow, this is complex, this is different, this is interesting. That was about 40 years ago in the early 1980s. So he was still remained a family therapist. He wrote some family therapy texts. He wrote for big family therapies, psychotherapy networker magazine. It was first family therapy, then became all kinds of psychotherapy. He wrote for the magazine a lot, did a lot of writing and thinking about this, and published a book. It took him a while, 10, 12 years before he actually even published a book, because he thought about it all that time. So now he has this model called internal family systems, where we invite our clients to look inside themselves and notice how we get polarized, how we are striving to be balanced but get out of balance, and the extreme things we do to find some kind of balance and to take care of our emotions. So that's I hope not too long of a story.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
Sense of what the model is. And go ahead, Kate. Yeah.
No, and I know that you bring a particularly compassionate lens to addictive processes and firefighters and managers polarizing over behaviors. And I wondered if you could speak to your particular interest in addictive processes. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I my external family, some of my individual family and external family, and if you go around my family tree, we cover all kinds of all the addictions, food, alcohol, drugs, sex issues, all these things, they're all there in my extended family. They've affected my life in certain different kinds of ways. So when, and in my career, the first, part of my career, I worked almost entirely with people who were survivors of trauma, a lot of sexual trauma, family trauma, abusive families. And there's so much complexity with all of it, because you work with someone who both hates and loves their parent, who both rejects and needs their other parent, who both wants a relationship with a sibling and doesn't want a relationship with a sibling. And then the complexities within themselves around, their tenderness and yet their fierce ability to protect themselves. So I learned so much about being a therapist from women and men who've been through very complex childhood trauma and learned how to protect themselves, kind of that never again strength, and had this sort of intuitive knowing that there were little parts of them that they needed to still take care of. So this was all my experience, both my family experience in certain ways and then my work experience. So then when I come to hear IFS, I think, oh, and I can hear the polarity right away. I can hear the parts that get involved with some kind of soothing, medicated kind of process, food, alcohol, drugs, because there's pain. And yet the other parts of that person are either ignoring it and just striving to be perfectionistic and super successful, right? I have to be good because I'm kind of bad in my private time. Or there's just that polarity, which is I hate that I do it and I have to stop that I do it. So it all fit in with, the complexity in certain family relationships in my life and the complexity of the clients that I was working with. And I felt like this model really gives us a clear, sort of crystal clear way to understand that. It felt as plain as day to me. Okay, I see what we have to do here.
And what's so beautiful as well, you speak in a way like the language of holism and organicity and oneness, in the sense of you, the client, the system, the working. There's a band called Gong in the UK and they had a song, Politics Begins in the Kitchen. Right. And it's like, yeah, politics begins inside me, then inside you, and inside the therapist too, which I know, you speak so compassionately about addiction and the history also. There's so much history, religious history and history in general about not allowing ecstatic joy in any way, and the shame and polarization around sex and alcohol and drugs. And you can see the difference in places like Holland and Portugal, where they've made some changes to certain laws. but also the way you come across as, and speaking to your own experience. So you're not pathologizing. You're not kind of saying, you know, thou, me, you know, you're not above or below. I'm with all my experience, I'm with you.
That's such a good way to put it, Kate, because that is really my intention.
Yeah.
And it's just you nailed it. I mean, my intention when it's so easy to make the other person other.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to make someone who's acting in out of control ways,
Yeah,
look self-harming, look pretty destructive,
yeah,
very high risk, to stigmatize that, to say, well, they're out of control, what's
Yeah.
wrong with them, why are they doing that? And it's a sort of, it's also, like you say, it's cultural. We have gotten so far away from the ways in which, for, you know, I just read, where did I read this? Oh yeah, they found some stuff in Egypt just recently. There's a new discovery in Egypt, a new burial ground, and they found evidence of a brewery that's 5,000 years old. Okay, you know, so they were making beer and using it for celebration and for honoring and for rituals. They believe. You know, there's evidence of using natural plants. You know, these are things that have been a part of the human experience for thousands of years. Gambling dice. I forget how many thousands of years they found a gambling dice. You know, so these are not new behaviors for humans, to gamble, to use substances to have a more ecstatic or intensified experience, to use substances to celebrate, to gather around. You know, and of course, food has been a part, you know, it's a daily ritual for every human, more or less. And to use food to celebrate has been, you know, there from the beginning. Sex, obviously, we've had sex since the beginning of time. But many rules, who you can have it with, when, how, and all of those kinds of things have evolved in different cultural ways to do it. So, you know, we get so confused, and I say we, I guess I'll call about the culture I know, Western culture, Americanized, around trying to be in control and good, and then at the same time sort of using sex, drugs, rock and roll to sort of celebrate and to sell things, you know, to market. You know, we're supposed to have all these ideas about women's bodies, men's bodies, how they're supposed to look. And then we have all this 10,000 cooking shows. You know, it's just a confusion. And if what would happen if our culture was less polarized around what's good about food, what's good about alcohol or drugs. There's so much that's bad about drugs. I'm not here to advocate it. I'm just saying that they're here and they're part of life, and that most people have used, experimented, tried, or have used drugs without having a difficulty. Most people have used alcohol without having difficulties for them. And many people have used them and have had difficulties, get themselves out of those difficulties pretty much on their own. So high percentages of all that. But for the people who are stuck, right, who can't stop using food in a way that doesn't help them, using substances in a way that doesn't help them, for them, we assume that there's a reason for that. And the short answer reason is that they have some kind of pain and out of balance.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And it's so, what's so beautiful is that I know, because you've spoken to being the eldest of 6 and a parentified child, and your mother being low, and so you being born into caring and born caring and committing, and I know that like that does mean you really show up, right? So it's like it's also a superpower, even though I imagine it was burdened at certain points. It's also a superpower. Like it's like the way it's a part of your structural system. And so like you care, you're not sitting on the edge going, yeah, show me. I'll sit back. You do the work. You're like, yeah, you do the work, but I'm going to be here with you. Like there's, you know, like in IFS, there's that thing about self energy. And EFT, some of the self energy comes from the therapist, right? But in IFS, it's like you're encouraging the client to get their self-energy. But it really feels with you, Cece, that you also bring a huge amount of that love to the table, with the compassion, with for yourself, for your background, but also for the client. I wondered if you could speak to that kind of compassion and what difference that might make. Yeah.
Well, that's such a yeah, it's an interesting thing of what you're saying, you know, that I was all sort of all in, and I guess that's a great reflection of that. That's how I grew up, right? You know, diving into the being born into the deep end and staying there, sort of. And that's a great way to think about that. And I guess as a clinician and as a therapist, I think I read years and years ago, these women who were operating out of the Stone Center, they talked about this in the 1980s, about not wanting to have a hierarchical relationship with their clients. And it really just hit me. It just hit me very, very strongly. These women at the Stone Center, and they did there was a lot of, like in any profession, a lot of the people who wrote about therapy were men. And so there was a real effort for women to write about therapy through a woman's lens. And one of the things was to be less hierarchical and really noticing how that sort of, another phrase, wounded healer, that we all have been on a journey. So for me, I certainly have been on a journey of my own. And so I like to view my clients, and when I'm teaching, want to invite all of us to view ourselves as on a journey together. And I'm catching you at this part of your journey. And there's skills I have that I'm going to share with you. But I really think that that's the way I like to think of the clinical relationship. So, and when you're working with addiction, and that is sort of stigmatized by the culture, as well as we stigmatize ourselves, what's wrong with me, right? It's also culturally supported to stigmatize. It's a really extra effort and extra important for the clinician to work with our own parts that might stigmatize or be in judgment, not to pathologize that, because when you're talking to someone who's being selfish and mean-spirited, and, you know, we have reactions, but to help that step back so that we can help that person access their center again. And I think the best way to help that process of them getting centered again is for me to stay centered. If I'm off balance, we say in IFS, parts yields parts. If I'm in judgment, I'm going to create defensiveness. But what about if they're defensive and it doesn't create judgment in me? What if I stay centered, even though they're defensive, even though they're rationalizing their behavior, even though they're minimizing the damage of their behavior to self or others? I could polarize that and say, hey, you need to be thinking about this a different way. And I might have a part that was inclined to, but what happens if I stay centered? So the last thing I'll say, and I'm glad you're bringing up this idea of self and the slight difference with IFS, it's not just me getting myself centered and staying in touch with my own compassion and my own calm. It's also the belief that even people who are out there, who have been suffering a long time, have depression, anxiety, using substances, food, whatever, we still think of them as having a self, having that sort of inner awareness, that inner sense of self. So I'm always talking to that self. I don't know who's talking back. Different parts might be talking to me, which they are. But I want to address that center that is really listening behind all the protection, all the shielding, all the behaviors. And I think IFS gives us a way to think about our clinical relationship that way that I think is useful.
So wonderful. And I know you do work, and I'm going to ask you about whether you do it online, but I know you do these workshops in person to help the therapist tell their own story, which this, like, I mean, I've heard that, for example, there's Al-Anon for doctors and nurses in London. I've heard that. I don't know the specifics of it. It's kept quite private because there's a stigma for doctors and nurses to have vulnerability, right? Because they're supposed to be the experts. So there's some things that have been opened up, some private spaces for doctors and nurses. But what I'm hearing is you are really opening up these spaces for therapists, and it just feels so important and so needed, because actually it's pretty dangerous, therapists let on the loose with all their with all their triggers and all their stuff and all their judgments and reactions with clients, and it to actually facilitate that healing, which you're doing. And I'd really love to ask you more about that. I know you run workshops. I'm curious whether you're going to do any online or any books.
I am going to.
Brilliant.
Yeah,
brilliant.
Thanks for bringing that up. And I think you meant doctors and nurses in AA, or you meant in a 12-step.
Oh, sorry, Al-Anon.
You mean Al-Anon, that's the family of members
the
of
families. I mean, I'm sure it's AA as well.
So
but no,
family,
it's Al-Anon.
I see what you're saying.
Al-Anon.
Yeah.
What I heard. I mean, this is.
I'm sure there's both.
Yeah.
My point.
Yeah.
They may be people who also have gotten involved in using, and they're working with that stigma, but
yes,
also.
But good point. That stigma too. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah. But family members, and that I think that the therapists kind of can suffer from that same
that's
kind of stigma, and I think that's what you were trying to say.
Yes.
That's what you meant. Okay, good.
That's it.
That we have some idea of how we're supposed to be, how our family is supposed to be.
That's right.
Shame about a divorce, or shame about a child with problems, shame about our own struggling,
all that
addictive use or depression. How can I, if I'm just struggling with anxiety, how can I help other people? So those kinds of,
and other people might say, "What, you're a therapist and you can't sort yourself, heal thyself," right? Yeah.
Right. So there's a culture around it, but also, so many therapists are hard on themselves around.
Yes. Yeah.
In IFS, I mean, we don't look for perfection. Like, well, when I get to be a therapist after I'm perfect, when will that start?
Yeah.
But instead, what happens though is then we can get to know our own parts. And I think the other piece about IFS that I think is very healing is that there is sort of a way in which we get to connect to our most tender or vulnerable parts. They might feel young, or maybe they're a part that's a little bit older in age in our memory, but it's our vulnerability. We all have sort of core vulnerability. It's our shared humanity, our ability to be sensitive, our sense of feeling innocent, carefree, open-hearted, trusting. And when we are, and we're sort of open to the world, we absorb what's in the field when we're in that place. So for all of us, since life is not perfect and we're never raised in a perfect environment, we've absorbed certain kinds of injuries, disconnects, misattunements, pain, feeling not seen, feeling not understood. And for some people, it's been just terrible chronic exploitation of their childhood. But IFS does give us a way to connect to our tenderest places. And when we can do that, it strengthens, it bolsters us. We are less likely to get extreme with protection, with judgment, or with other kinds of acting out behaviors, to call them that, other kinds of behaviors that are medicating us. When we can really actually have access to our vulnerability. We would say in IFS, it's our vulnerability is sort of the root, and then our protectors come up to protect us, so we're not re-injured. Go ahead.
No, it's what you also, thank you so much, beautifully said. And what you also spoke to was, I mean, I would say it's shamanic, but what I mean by shamanic is how extraordinary the therapist journey is. So for example, you went into family therapy and worked with families where sexual abuse and violence occurred, and then you discovered that your mother had suffered in certain ways, and you're like, what? I'm working in this field, and this happened to my mother, and I think this happens to therapists over and over and over and over and over, and clients show up, and you're like, I understand what you're talking about, because I know that, right? And it's extraordinary how sometimes therapists are just one step ahead of clients because of they may have got somewhere, but therapists like you spoke to in the lockdown, in the COVID, in that period, right? Everybody was finding out in the moment what was the next stage. What therapists weren't even one step ahead. So there were no step ahead. So it was like everything went equal. And like you spoke to, a lot of social justice issues came up and a lot of different things came up. So a lot was on the table all at once, which was a lot for everybody. But therapists weren't suddenly these separate people that could just be the therapist. So the reason why I'm asking you about this is I love the thought that you're creating spaces where the vulnerability and the protectors and the managers, but the therapists can tell their stories. Like there can be this open spaces for, you know, the deaths, the suicides, the addictions, the losses, the gains, the achievements, the not achievements. Like these stories can even be known, because maybe some people haven't even joined them together because they've never been in a space to tell the whole story, if they never did that.
Thanks for bringing me back to that thread, which is that, yeah, because of my own story, I thought about it for 20 years in a way. And then I thought I should do a workshop about this, you know, I have my own powerful story of looking and thinking, how the heck do how do I end up in this field? And then I find out my own mom suffered in certain ways. And I didn't know this, you know, and yet some unconscious, right? Some part of me is drawn to that very work. And that's not everyone's story, but everyone has a story who's a therapist. And, you know, being a trainer for a long time of IFS, many of the people I run into are other therapists. So, and I know the stories are quite powerful. So I have started setting up workshops where therapists come together and we do different exercises around, and experiential exercises around getting to know some parts of our early learning about how we learned when we first started noticing people around us needed help, how that impacted us, and how it was for us to have a voice and when that started happening in our lives. So those kinds of things I think are so helpful and powerful for us because we are the listeners. And that's a beautiful thing to be. Our needs are not directly met in a therapy, and we enjoy our work, so certain needs are met, but not our personal needs. Of course, that's set aside in the clinical relationship. And so where do we take not just our needs, but our story, our impact, not just talking about how this therapist, this client affected me. That's interesting too, but just who am I separate from my work? Who am I? How has being a therapist and focused on other people's intimate lives impacted me? How has my life, going through cancer, going through a divorce, going through certain things with my child, or not having children, but wanting, or this with but how have these things of life impacted what I say in the clinical room? Who am I? You know, so I think these are just good questions we don't have to have the answer to. At one point, I thought I was asking a question early on in the workshops, like, why did I become a therapist? And then I thought, no, that's a question. That's not a question that you have to have an answer to. It's a question that you can hold open and allow it to emerge and unfold, which is all the ways in which I have been impacted to choose this field and then to buy this field.
And it feels like, you know, you are birthing something divine, like a divine sort of feminine motion, because like we come from a patriarchal history, which has affected men and women and non-binary, trans, all people. It's affected everyone, that we have above and below and certain people in charge. And part of that is like doctors are separate to people and therapists are separate people, and with these blank slates with no personality. Not true, clearly. And there's total reasons why clients find certain therapists. And you know, I believe teachers are often the ones that grow through the workshop, right? Because they get all the challenges, they get all the growth, right? So when you when you sign up to be a teacher, you're the one who's like going through the mill often. Obviously, you spoke to finding your seat, which is part of the journey. But you somehow doing this work, it feels really related to like the de-shaming of addiction and the de-shaming of them and us, right? That because the therapist is often the person in the family, quite often, if it's a vacation, it's quite often the helper, the adultified child, the one who didn't have time to play. So they didn't have time to have a story. They had too much to do, right? So for you to like do this big healing, talking about the politics in the kitchen of the person who's like the watcher, the doer, the controller. I'm going to make sure you're okay. I'm going to save everyone from dying. Maybe.
Yes, right.
That person, if they get to have a story and they get to play and have fun and they get to be a person, like what happens to the world then?
Right. These are such, I love that. It's just evocative what you're saying, Kate. It really is. It's quite a beautiful way to think about it, because, right, when the healer is suffering, if that's my role and I'm suffering, what really is going to happen in the therapy room?
Yeah.
Deeply suffering. And most therapists are very good at putting our stuff aside. There's a classic joke, how do you regulate a therapist? Put a client in front of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So we're very good at staying regulated around a lot of stuff and helping our stuff step back.
That's right.
But at the same time, it's there. So what about when it's in certain environments, when it's safe and okay to welcome whatever it is that we so often put in the background, to put it right up in front.
and what was so beautiful, I know you've spoken to this, but what was so beautiful is that if the person in the family who's the helper, the healer, the protector, and it doesn't have to be a therapist, it's the person with that role, right?
Yeah.
If they could relax a little bit, what then happens to the other people? Because we're all in relation, aren't we? So you setting this work off, right, it's very impactful on their families and their relationships. Because like you said, I'm fine, no, you didn't say this, but I'm fine if I'm in charge, or I'm working with a client, but what happens when with all those other relationships, right? And I'm not in charge,
It's such a great image, Kate, to think about the ways in which when we, in IFS language, if I'm in self energy, if I'm balanced, if I'm listening to my inner voice and I'm embodied, right? Not just in my head, if I'm really here, then how does that affect things versus me being in my head in an activated sort of fixing role?
Yeah.
When I'm talking a lot about working with firefighter parts in the model, we say that there's managers and firefighters, and they have sort of different roles. Managers being keep it together, firefighters being to soothe and relieve and shift gears. And we need both. We need to stay on task, which is managers, but we need to take a break, which is firefighters. But so Dick called them firefighters because he said they're putting out the fires of shame when they medicate us. But even when they're not adapting to some kind of emotional difficulty, we need to have that kind of balance. So in the clinical relationship, if I'm working with, if I'm in my manager part, it's systemic, and the other part's going to feel like it has to defend itself. And there's so much about when we're working with eating disorders, gambling, porn, preoccupations, alcohol use, opiate use. There's so much fear about, what do we fear? We fear that person could die.
Yeah.
And they can't die. In fact, I've read once the amount of deaths from anorexia are massive.
Oh yeah.
For instance, in terms of disordered eating. So on a long way, and it feels more obvious. We hear more about drug use that results in death. I don't even want to call it drug overdose, because many times they've just been impacted by chemicals in the drugs, and whether or not they overdosed, is an issue. They have been impacted in the States, at least, by a lot of really poisonous kinds of chemicals that have been put in street drugs and so forth. Anyway, it's a high risk behavior. So the person working with them obviously has fears for someone they love or someone they care about or someone they're working with as their client. So when we're fearful, which is a vulnerable emotion, we can protect ourselves from fear by getting into our protectors. So then we might, let's make a contract, let's make a plan. Why don't you try this? We can get into sort of that hierarchical place where I know more than you do. And I'm going to stay away from my fear and stay on top of this. And I know this, and these are my ideas, and this is what I think you need to do. And putting that kind of energy out there. And what I always say, it's understandable. Of course, we have those parts. How could we not? But what happens if we don't, like you say, lead from that? What happens when we lead from, you and I are working on this together. You and I are going to discover together your way through this thing. I don't know the way through for you. Sometimes I have ideas and I'll tell them to you, but then after I say that to you, I want to say, how did my idea land on you? How is it landing for you? So creating this sense of collaboration and openness and inviting that person's self-energy and inner wisdom to be a part of the healing process. And so the idea that, and that because that person who's using, I read once, everyone who's using a substance, there's 9 different people that are impacted by them, or, there's sort of, so their parents or their siblings or their children or whomever, they're people they work with. So there's such a big system around this. And I do think when we use IFS and when we recognize that we're in a protective place and we're protecting ourselves from our vulnerability, the opportunity to recognize that and work with that, so we are less shielded from our vulnerability, but are connected, not from a place of one down childlike vulnerability, but from a place of our shared humanity. I think good things can happen.
That is beautiful. And so beautiful and just so humane. And maybe I could ask you about social justice, because I know that that's very close to your heart and you're very connected to social justice. And maybe I could ask you about what you're aware of with IFS and social justice, as in Black therapists, as in inclusion with trans Black therapists, LGBTQ plus issues. What's and I know there are movements, and I know there are Black therapist groups in IFS, and I know there are some movements, and I wondered if you could speak to that, because all of this is kind of all of us together, isn't it? All of us in, right, and parts together, and compassion and togetherness. So I wonder if there's something you could speak to about that social side.
I think, I'm relieved. As painful as the triggers have been, the events that have triggered, at least in the States, the death and murders by authorities over individual citizens that have triggered these massive movements, the source of them is just really painful. However, I'm relieved because I do feel the conversation is changing. And I do feel that those of us who've been raised with privilege, who maybe didn't always know that we had privilege, we didn't have money, or we didn't seem like we had opportunity, but not exactly even understanding what privilege was, and not understanding the way in which the white patriarchal world ruled our culture, and was the violence, not just legal, manipulation, but violence that was used to control Native people, Black Americans, brown, as we say in the United States, Asian. So having these conversations is a relief in a sense. I do think it's a painful conversation. I do think it's challenging. I do think that those of us who are white are the learners, and we are always learning. And the way in which IFS works is, when we notice, we would say the parts of us that would discriminate, would be racist, would think of someone in terms of their appearance or our preconceptions or our assumptions. Those would be protective parts of us, protecting us from our vulnerability. And so it gives us a chance to sort of examine how a part of me could be angry at someone or judgmental of someone or dismissive of someone or afraid of someone. I would have parts of me carrying those emotions. And if I get to learn about that, and what's the root behind some of those behaviors, I think IFS can really help with that. That is the intention. In IFS, we're always working as a therapist. It's an ongoing dialogue, working with our own parts and taking that ongoing dialogue to the social justice movement, I think is really useful, because if we don't look at what our vulnerability is, we can't get to our shared humanity. If we're shielded, then I'm shielded from my shared humanity with you. I'm an protector. I'm not aware of my own vulnerability, then I can't connect to yours. And so it's one protector to another.
And it's just because I'm in the UK, so I don't know, but have there been dialogues opened up in the US around these different diversity issues?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that changes. There's a little bit more of a national conversation, and there's absolutely more written about and more space given to on news shows, on other kinds of, in newspapers, top, sort of very prominent newspapers will make sure are doing a different job of bringing in people of color to write and to contribute to the national conversation about how to address these issues, which are, the racism is just
and in IFS, that's what I'm curious, because in the UK, some there were some groups set up where therapists started to have discussions around diversity between therapists, like,
sorry,
and so I wondered if that was opened up in IFS. I wondered.
Oh, huge. Yes, absolutely. There's an enormous amount. Our conference last year, we run a conference every year for about 30 years. The entire theme of that conference was welcoming the global majority, which is the non-white, into the conference. And so that was the majority of presenters at the conference. So we have made changes into how we hire people into the training programming to open that up to people whose English is not their first language, who are from, the non-white culture, the LGBTQ community, trans community, and that we are opening our the leadership at the top, the leadership as trainings, the participation of people as assistants in trainings, and to the people who take trainings. The last thing they've been doing was doing some scholarships specifically given to Black men who have been extremely marginalized and discriminated against and controlled in our culture. So
that was for trainings.
Yeah, opening up just in a training, working very closely with the Black Lives Matter group or Black Therapists Rock group to do trainings with them specifically for their communities. So there's a long way to go, as there always is, but we are on the road.
And Cece, what would you like? I know you're doing a book, aren't you, with Martha Sweezy? Is that, or have you done?
Yes,
on addictive processes?
Yes.
Yeah. Where are you at with your book?
We are in the editing phase. So over the next few months, we'll be finalizing some things. I'm hoping it's out this fall. It's a manual, it's a workbook, it's a skills book. It's very, very, what I want is for therapists to be able to pick this book up and know how to intervene, have ideas about how to intervene. And also there's exercises for anyone to do if we want to look at our own parts. It's sort of a universal process. You may not feel like your behavior has become dysfunctional, but it's a universal process to have one part of us trying to fix another part of us.
Oh, yeah.
And that polarity it's sort of the human part of the human condition in a sense. So
yeah,
I think that I'm addressing a lot around those polarities, and in particular when those polarities become extreme. So I'm hoping that it's really useful.
Amazing. And what about your working with the therapist story? Is that a book too, do you think? Or
well, I had to have this one under my belt. my gift.
Of course, yeah, of course.
The gift is a gift of gab, Kay. You know, my first thought isn't, let me write this down.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, absolutely.
But I
Absolutely.
do think that I have actually thought about that, and I have interviewed therapists around putting together something around our story. So I have to finish this. I don't have the bandwidth in this moment, but I love the idea of finding a way for that to be recorded.
Beautiful. Now, Cece, I hope you don't mind, but you have a comics sensibility. You have natural timing and a really gassy laugh. You know, like your laugh would open up a room. So are you into comedy? And you live in Chicago, and like there's a lot of music and comedy and arts and
there is
big buildings and everything in Chicago. So is that, did you grow up with a lot of like comedy and timing, and do you know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, right. Second City is here.
Yes, all of those comedians came out of, you know,
absolutely,
people we all know came out of Chicago. That's right. So is that part of you and part of your story? And
no, Kate, I appreciate the feedback that I have a good comic timing, and I'm glad I do that.
And the laugh. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like that boom, crack laugh. You know, it's very rhythmic.
Well, that's good to know. I think maybe I think I'm just lucky. I think I'm just lucky. I do like to think, I don't want to take myself too seriously.
Well, that's even better.
I start right there. I don't want to take myself too seriously.
That's it.
And after that, you know, so I think, well, and I also think though, in a slightly more serious or direct vein, I do think humor connects us and normalizes us.
Oh yeah.
Who can share a laugh about our shared humanity, our shared difficulties.
That's right.
It's really freeing for all of us.
And as soon as you laugh, like a deep belly laugh is like an orgasm. It actually is embodied work, right? It moves from the belly through. So it's like literally a release, isn't it?
I never thought about it that way, but that's great.
Like we go to comedy, like most people will not go to therapy. Most people will have seen some comedy, right? And they get that comic release. But that was what was so interesting about meeting you, Cece, is like, I just felt like you speak about having a seat, but you have your seat and you have your outfit and you have your look and you have your laugh and boom, you're stage ready, right? Which gives confidence to the client or the workshop leaders, right? But with the humility of the beginner's mind, right? You're still here to see what happens present moment, but with that stage presence, you know? And it's like a really, really big combo, which makes me one last question, Cece. Do you train the trainers? Because of course it takes trainers a long time to relax and not have to be perfect and get it all right and not be threatened by people's parts in the room. And, you know, that takes work too. And because you seem to have that down to me. And I wondered about that, whether you train trainers, right? About how to have their seat, how to have their, you know, that to relax and to be with and get curious and not get toppled, by the.
Yeah, well, no, I don't have that role of training the trainers. Although all of us, we all have 9 or 10 assistants or 12 training. So part of our space is staff development, which is for people to learn about their own parts in that setting. So, and the other thing about our trainings is we receive feedback from every participant is invited to give feedback for every training. So I have been evaluated for every training I've ever given.
Wow.
And so, you know, I have learned
wow.
That kind of feedback it's humbling, but it's also helps me learn, and staff, you know, gives me feedback and it helps me learn. So I think there's some mutuality around all of that.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful, isn't it? So in a way, like I remember this friend speaking to me who writes books and gets all kinds of reviews from good to bad to indifferent. And I went, how do you manage that? And he went, a third will like you, a third will hate you. You got to like yourself.
Isn't that great? Yeah, exactly. And that's balance. that person is balanced right
Yeah.
there. And that's what we're looking for, is to not be thrown off our center
Yeah.
by other people's reactions to us. And it can take a little work though, because
Yeah.
we all have a part. I wouldn't say we all, or we almost all. We have a part that wants to be loved, that needs
Of
to be loved,
course.
be cared of,
Of
and
course.
wants to feel respected too.
Of course.
So all of that's in there. But at that again, that is our shared humanity. There's someone who doesn't want to be respected. There's someone who
Yeah.
doesn't want to be loved. So
That's so nice, because that's very compassionate to those parts as well. Because of course, if you are the helper,
right.
like there's a David Thoreau quote: if someone's coming round to your house to do good for you, to kind of be really do some nice things for you, run for your life. So like what I mean is like that the therapist, it takes a while for the therapist to settle, doesn't it? Because they just want to do good. They just want to like help. Understandably, they want to help people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
and I think redefining what help is. Redefining help as being present to their process, helping them learn more about their process so that they have more access to their natural, the self energy that they have, is a different way to look at it. And that means I got to do my work so that I'm not in my own parts to help them.
That's it. This was so awesome, Cece. Thank you so much.
Interesting to me too. I love all the art world that you're throwing into the therapy world. There's good crossover there.
Yeah, thank you. It all, I think, like a good therapist is really creative, and a good creative is therapeutic. And this is what seems to be coming across to me. In order for both sides to be for someone to be the top of their game in either respect, they have to have done their work, if that makes sense to you.
Oh, it sure does.
So thank you, Cece. I can't wait for the online and the books.
Thank you so much.
I will send you this. Thank you, Cece. Bless you.
So that was Cece Sykes. What an amazing woman. What a celebration of a human being, really. And I hope you really enjoyed that. I so enjoyed it. It's inspired me completely. It's inspired me before meeting her, after meeting her, the whole thing just really inspired me to look at things with so much more compassion and depth, and to meet people with so much, lightness, but boundaries and love, really. So just meeting someone like her, with her embodiment, her diamond shape, and her equality and accessibility and humanity, expressing such unity of consciousness while being aware of difference, it's just really made me feel that this path is such a path of development, and can we develop in all different ways so that we come into oneness with ourselves. So I hope you really enjoyed that. Please tune in for more podcasts, and wishing you a lovely day. Thanks.